This is Councilman Jim Holmes, and we will now call the meeting of the Budget and Audit Committee to order on November 10th, 2020 at 1:30 sharp. Joining me today online are Councilman Hector Sabito from District 2 and Councilman John Kennard from District 3, John, and myself, Councilmember Jim Holmes from District 5. A little caveat I have to read here at the beginning. On March 16, 2020, the governor suspended various provisions of the Open Meetings Act pursuant to his state of disaster authority. The change was effective March 16, 2020, until further notice or until the state of disaster declaration expires. In accordance with physical distancing guidelines, and while providing as much transparency as possible, this meeting will not be open to the public. This meeting is being broadcast live at WCCC TV. The audio is also being recorded. The video and audio recordings will be available to the public. According to the governor and attorney general, statutes that may require face-to-face interaction between members of the public and public officials are suspended, provided, however, that the governmental body offers alternative methods of communication with their public officials. This includes public comment on agenda items. In an effort to allow for as much public input as possible, those who wish to submit their written comments on a listed agenda item were asked to submit their comments to the city secretary's office today by 11 a.m. The city secretary will read into the record the comments submitted for the items on the agenda at the appropriate time. So the first item is the minutes approval of the Budget and Audit Committee of October 18, 2020. Were there any comments? Those minutes will be approved as presented. Next item on the agenda is discussion of Bradley Ford, city manager. He's going to introduce the discussion of the proposed capital improvement program, debt capacity, and proposed 2021 bond issues with Masterson Advisors, LLC, and city staff. Bradley.
Thanks, council member, and good afternoon to each of you. We appreciate your time today. As you mentioned, Councilmember Holmes, this discussion is going to primarily revolve around our recommended capital improvement program, CIP program, and I'm pleased to be joined by Isaiah Preza, our Director of Office and Management and Budget. He'll be leading this discussion with support from Paul Diaz, our Budget Manager. And I'd like to turn it over to Isaiah at this time.
Thank you, sir. Let me share my screen. Okay. So good afternoon, council members. At the last budget and audit meeting, council provided us direction on the percentage distribution changes between the O&M and the debt rate. That guidance drives our FY21 general debt CIP recommendation, which we'll be presenting today. In addition, our financial advisor will be discussing the current market conditions, debt capacity scenarios, the COVID impact on the bond rating processes, a refunding of bonds, and the bond process timeline. Now I'd like to hand over the presentation to our budget manager, Mr. Paul Diaz.
Good afternoon, council. At the October Budget and Audit Committee, council gave direction to staff to size the FY21 CIP at $30.1 million. Also, direction was given that the Mars Old Hewitt Road project part of that package. That left a remaining capacity of $18.6 million for the FY21 CIP. In the interim, what staff has done is put together a cross-departmental group to recommend to management and ultimately to council on how to allocate those funds. And about four things in mind. First, we want to be cognizant of what we've already been committed to, being mindful of our work capacity. So as part of our review, we looked at FY19, 20 projects and made sure that those projects could still get done in a timely manner as we start to plan for 21 projects. The other thing we wanted to do was ensure that we were seeking to improve the street network. We knew that Mars and Old Hewitt Road was part of the CIP in 21. We also knew that
Paul, will you stop for a minute? I want to make sure, council members, are y'all getting pauses in the?
Yeah, he's breaking up really bad.
Okay.
Yeah.
Agreed. I think he's still frozen right now.
Okay. Give us a moment. Isaiah, can you pick up on this presentation from this point?
Sure, absolutely. Can you guys hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, great. So, staff, the part of the process also aligned with city council goals for 21. And the proposed plan was fiscally constrained with the rate structure planned increases previously discussed with city council back in June, July timeline. This is the starting list of our CIP candidate projects. So the CIP strategic team, given our debt funding capacity, which you gave us guidance on last budget audit meeting, had to kind of scrub this list and prepare a planned recommendation for you for 21. And this is the ultimate recommendation from those discussions. So as you can tell, the majority of the project allocation for 21 is streets, which again aligns with city council strategic goals. We also have some park projects for China Springs and Cotton Palace park development. And then we also have general park improvement programs to assist with replacing some needed equipment. We also did want to point out to you on the China Springs and the Cotton Palace Park CIP, the reason we've outlined the future cost here is because we would be making a commitment to the out years, because the first year in 21 would be just the design phase. So moving into the out years, we'd go into the construction phases and also add some contingency to go along with it. This graph shows the impact of the PCI. Again, our FY21 recommended plan is heavily weighted on the streets. So we would be starting with a PCI of 49.3, and adding to that would be 1.43. And our estimated PCI for 21 after all these projects are completed would be about 50.73. What this graph illustrates is the PCI number versus the CIP recommended plan for streets. So for example, the Mars and Hewitt project here would be funding 11.5 million, the PCI impact would be 0.11, and so on. Mill and overlay, reclamation, preservation, and then a total PCI impact by funding and the impact to PCI, which matches the 1.3 illustrated here. This map.
This is Holmes. Can you go back to that slide? And I don't know, are we gonna go through the whole slide and maybe go back? Or I had a couple questions on a previous slide too, but on this one, like our beginning pavement condition index is 49.3. That's what we're saying, and this will get us to 50.73. That's the point of this slide, right?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. It is.
And it just seems like it's still low, but I mean, maybe that's where our trajectory is taking us. But are we saying that and here's where I want to be clear, I think I've asked this question in previous ones, if all of our funded project budgeted, and whether they're funded or not, in the last 3 years have been completed or not? Because I don't know if this is a complete, the 49.3 is as is today, without the completion of some of the 2018, 19, and 20 projects, or does that reflect what we've already kind of put out there and budgeted to spend? Again, I want to say that impact, the PCI would be higher if this number would reflect all of the projects that we've budgeted and kind of funded in previous budgets.
Yes, sir. And we do have Jim Reed available, who's a subject matter expert on the PCI. And so at this point, I'd like for him to address that question. If that's okay with the council members.
Yeah. Is he on the call? Or in a feature meeting, or is he actually on the call?
This is Jim Reed. Can you hear me?
Oh, yeah. Great. Hey, Jim, how you doing?
I'm doing great. Thank you for this opportunity. Yes, sir. You've got a great question. We do have some projects like 5th Street that you see outside the door that is not completed and not figured in. So the 49.3 is live reporting off cartograph off of projects that have been completed as of October 1st. So there's several projects that are in the background that would influence that PCI throughout the year as those projects come to be completed.
Great. Thanks for that, because it seems to me that and again, it's a difference between having a project sort of approved by council, basically funded but not completed. I guess I know it's hard to do, but it would be interesting to me if we could do it. Is to what would the impact do once those budgeted, funded, and approved projects were completed? Would that take the PCI to 55 or 60 or 49.5 or I'm trying to get an idea of, because I know that this council over the last 4 or 5 years has done a lot, committed a lot to infrastructure and a lot to roads. And I just want to be able to see, hey, I know that you're taking a picture today, but on the 2018, 19, and 20 projects that have already been funded but not completed, if those projects were completed, what would that PCI look like? And then what would what would the 2021 projects look like if they were completed? Because again, we're taking the 2021 as complete. We'll raise it by 1.43. I guess I want to figure out that piece of the puzzle that says pending projects that have been funded and approved. Where will that take the PCI?
Yes, sir. And the number you see today, the 1.43, is strictly reflective of what they're looking at for the street CIP that's under discussion today. We have looked at that number for management, and we're looking at a number about 52. We're going to be close to that when we wrap up all projects that have been funded to date by council, dating back to the first year of the pavement program, FY19.
Great, Jim. That's the exact question I had. So more around 52. So the 1.43 will get us up to whatever 53 and a half ish or whatever. I just like to see that. The goal of this council again is to get that PCI gradually up. It's taking a lot of money, a lot of time and a lot of effort and a lot of work by you guys, which I appreciate. But I just want to I want to see that number keep going up. Thanks.
Along those same lines, I would, and I don't know if we have this, Bradley, but have we put together a projection of what it would take to get us to the higher percentile as far as like projects that need to be worked on, the money that it'll take to get us there anywhere in the 70 to 80th PCI?
Yes, Councilmember Sabito, we do have a handy resource that Jim Reed and our team can provide that shows how to get to, I think, 70, and we could certainly run scenarios beyond 70. And what I would say is it's a continual, substantial investment in the $30+ million range. But we'd be happy to provide that to the council members at a later budget and audit or a council meeting.
I would like to see it only because I think that it would help us, as we said. I mean, we always know that there's going to be infrastructure needs in our city. I mean, that goes without saying. And as soon as you repair one street, 10 years down the road, 12 years down the road, it's going to need repair again. But there has to be a point where we're already up in the 70th percentile. And if it means council rearranges maybe some priorities to get us there and what we need to do to get us there in the next few years, I would definitely like to see that because I just think that we're making good progress, but we could be making more as well.
Yeah, I think the other thing that this slide highlights that y'all are intuitively seeing this, I think, but on a project that's such a regional priority like Mars Hewitt, we're spending $11.5 million likely on that project, and it's having virtually nil impact on PCI, but we know it's going to have an impact on safety of pedestrians, safety of traffic movement, as well as safety of movement of goods for economic development. And so I think the PCI is an easy to know performance measure for our street network, but there are times that our investments won't perfectly align with that measure. And this is a good example of it, where that $11.5 million project has a much greater impact on the community than the 0.11 PCI net gain that it's showing.
That's a really good point, Bradley. I didn't think about that. It really
Yeah,
has no effect on the PCI, but it's definitely a safety issue over there for sure. Go ahead, John.
No, I mean, and you just see, just to Bradley's point, you see the bang for the buck on the mill and overlay and the preservation, just how much more, I could get the number up, but that's because you're spreading it around across some, many more kind of lane miles, but it's a much less intensive procedure than what we're doing with the Mars and Hewitt Drive one. So it's what Jim has been kind of pounded into us, that reconstruction is expensive. That part is, and the mill and overlay and the preservation is really kind of where you get the most bang for your buck.
Yeah, in my recollection, to Hector's question, I mean, I can recall, as we started this out, I think it was before Hector got on council, that I think Jim Reed showed us a budget of, it was in excess, Hector, of $30 million a year for, I believe, a 7-year period. Kind of got us up in a very 30,000 foot view of where we needed to go to get to that 70 or 65 or 70 on the PCI. That's the kind of commitment it was going to take. And our first couple of years, we were kind of trending toward that direction, but we're just, we're not hitting pause here. We're continuing to go forward and continue to increase it, but we're not at the rate that we were thinking originally.
And it might be a good idea to revisit that with some new council members that are joining us and bring them up to speed as well. So just a thought for future reference.
Good point. Go on, Isaiah.
This visualization is a map that shows the planned project activity for FY21. You'll notice the legend activity here tells you that the type of material that's going to be used. Microsurface is in the yellow, slurry seal is in the brown, and then purple is the mill and overlay projects, and then reclamation finally is on the red. And this is provided by the streets department, and this is the aerial view of the plan. As part of your handout, you should have received the detail of the actual projects by streets and the funding for each of those projects.
Hey, Isaiah, sorry, before we get off of this, if we could go back just because it looks like we're going to be moving on to the utilities. From the starting list to what, and I appreciate y'all addressing our priorities and making streets and then where you could parks the priority. Bradley or somebody, can y'all talk to the plan for the traffic signal modification, some of the facilities upgrades, the engineering work, kind of what impact not doing that this upcoming year will have, and kind of what the plan is to eventually get to those?
Paul, do you feel comfortable taking that?
I do. Isaiah, would you mind backing up to the earlier slide that showed the total request? One more. There we go.
Yeah.
So this is where we began the process here, and as we talked about, we have a staff from multiple departments that reviewed the list. And you see some of these, for example, the infrastructure leverage, which was an attempt on our part to have some funds available, maybe to partner with private developers. The bridge improvements was another one you see here, and then the stormwater CIP. All of those three did not make the cut as we see going forward. A couple of thoughts here. The stormwater CIP as a candidate for funding through the drainage utility the council created, so that gave us some room there, certainly. Infrastructure leverage is something that's nice, but you'll see that with the roadway impact fees and the subdivision regs, we'll be looking at developer participation overall as we go forward. So that's something that we thought could wait. The bridge improvements, again, is a project. We do have I believe 1.4 million set aside for the 17th Street Bridge. You'll see an agenda item on this next meeting for another bridge here in town. So we're making some progress there. It was just a matter of all of the projects that you see listed here. Again, how to make sure that we can address council's priorities and still make some improvements in some of the key areas. When we look at parks, for example, the China Spring Park, you'll see that number hasn't changed a whole lot. It really gets us started on land acquisition and some design planning there. We also have some cash and as well as bonds for some of the general park improvements. So we're not quite to that 650 level, but we are continuing to make some strides there because that's important to the council and to our citizens. I think all of these you see as you go down, facilities, we think some of that, we think there's some candidate for cash, particularly when we look at our end of year numbers that we'll be discussing with council fairly soon. So some of these, we have an opportunity perhaps to cash fund some of these as well going forward. So on the traffic signal modification and traffic management center, that's something that I believe you mentioned, Councilmember Kennard. We do have a budget. We do have money in the budget this year to do a traffic signal master plan. And a lot of that will include things that we think will affect us going forward. It'll have a capital improvement plan that will come out of that really gives us a clear strategy on how we can improve our signal system in the city. We also have discussions underway with TxDOT on a traffic management center, which is a long range view towards managing traffic along the I-35 corridor out into the future for the region, not only for the city. So those discussions will be ongoing as we move forward. Isaiah, if you can go to the next slide. So this is where we ended up again. China Spring, we felt was a priority and even a commitment going forward. So we're starting that process. And again, with the park improvements, we have 300,000 versus the 650. So it was a matter of taking that number, trying to find what we felt was within the council's priorities going forward. So this is the result of that effort. Not everything certainly can get funded, but when we're trying to keep it within that $30 million range and keeping with that percentage shift that we talked about at the last meeting, this is the best we could come up with, but certainly within that 30 million number that council gave us before, if council wishes to add or take away projects, we can certainly do that.
No, I appreciate that. I mean, I myself, I think what y'all are recommending is fine and great. I think we've seen just, again, from the impact to our street program, to our streets, just overall kind of score and condition, that the longer, if we wait on that and don't invest in any year, we just get further behind the, kind of the curve on that and just costs us more down the road. So but I think this exercise is good, and I appreciate y'all starting where you did and showing us what all was contemplated and then helping us see what didn't make the cut, just so we can be aware of kind of what might be coming down, the road in the future and what other needs are out there as council works to identify and then address those priorities. So I just wanted to say I appreciate the process. I agree with your recommendations, and I'm further appreciative of the emphasis on streets.
Thanks.
I agree. I agree with your recommendation, and I do want to point out that even though there might be a line item that's not showing up on here, for example, it's not meaning that it's not going to be done. It was just maybe funded through a different avenue, like the wastewater drainage fee. And so I think that even goes to more show the importance of creating that account so we can do more things like work on our streets with on capital projects that are more important, not more important, but I should say, but are very important to council, and how do we move forward with that? So I completely agree with the recommendations as well.
Yes, sir. I think going forward, we've talked about this with council in the past, and I know that council's well aware of this. The need to create capacity on the general side is really the pressing issue for us going forward, and the ability to fund our CIP. And we'll certainly be looking for opportunities to increase that capacity through revenue enhancements, through expenditure reductions, expenditure shifts, all those different vehicles that might give us tools to create additional capacity. We'll certainly be looking at those going forward.
This is Holmes. Before, as John said, before we get onto the solid waste stuff as well, while we're on pavement, can we go to that map again?
Yes, sir.
I would be remiss if I didn't say that large swaths of District 5 aren't showing up on here. My China Spring neighbors and my West Highway 84 constituents. Are there any projects in those neighborhoods? Because they're not showing up. The map does not include big parts of Waco, I'll say.
Councilmember, I think what we ought to probably show, I'm just going off memory here, but going off the 1819 and 1920 projects, I think a big chunk of at least the 84 corridor, we did a lot of preservation work in District 5. And so maybe we need to zoom it out a little bit, but also show the prior year activities. If Jim Reed's still on, he might be able to speak to that.
Yeah, and Bradley, that was going to be my second point, actually. Just layer in 2018, 19, and 20, just so we can show. What I've always liked about this is all districts are being worked on, and we're not, doing one over the other. And I think it makes sense. We're trying to use the dollars the best we can. But yeah, if we could maybe in a future meeting layer in, as you said, 2018, 19, and 20, and kind of at some point, all of these streets are going to be worked on. But go ahead, Jim.
Yes, sir. Absolutely. I think Bradley covered it well. A lot of the projects over in those areas, especially around Spiegelville Road and out on 1637 China Spring Highway, have been covered with an ongoing preservation effort or a past preservation effort. The first year of the pavement program, we had a significant need for preservation out in those areas. So we identified those and have tried to tackle those initial. And we have one package that's still open that is finishing up those two areas. But most of the streets in the China Spring area and most of the streets around Spiegelville Road have been completed. And, we got some big projects like Harris Creek that is under construction right now. So there's some significant projects that haven't been closed yet, but they are under construction.
We'll add that to our list of follow-ups for the council members.
Thanks, Bradley.
Yes, sir.
I didn't have any other questions.
All right. Thank you, council members. Now, as we move into the enterprise fund, starting with the solid waste funds, I'll transition the presentation back to our budget manager.
Thank you, Isaias. As we start talking about solid waste, you'll know that there's quite a bit of difference from what we had presented in the budget book to what staff's recommendation are. Those new projects were vetted with the team and identified with the stars there. You can see that we have $6.15 million recommended in the FY 2021 budget. Do want to point out that of the solid waste solid waste MSW 2400 project, that does include $1.52 million of taxable debt. This was in consultation with our financial advisor. We believe this will give the city some flexibility for evaluating options with that project in the future. Here's staff recommendation on the airport. This is consistent with what you've seen in the budget book. You will notice that a majority of the funding for this project comes from CARES Act, $6.3 million from CARES Act, with the remaining $1.2 million coming from FAA AIP funding. And this is a summed up view of the water utilities. This CIP for the utilities can be funded with the plan rates and schedules that we have previously shared with council. We were very cognizant of putting together a plan that fit within the financial framework that we have previously shared. As we dive into the projects individually, here's the water fund. Water system improvements is recommended to decrease by $500,000. And this is due to projected savings in the streets portion of the water improvement. Overall, you can see that variance from what we had in the budget book to what we're doing here, sharpen the pencils a little bit, and could save a little bit of money in that water system improvements. The cash portion and the debt portion are pretty close with the variance of the $500,000. Moving on to wastewater. One of the things that we wanted to show that we didn't have in the budget book, but wanted to show to council as we start talking about CIP. Previously, the city had issued the Brazos Basin funds, and those funds are going to repurpose, and this is how we have it. We have approximately $20.1 million. And you see the work out there at China Spring, Gurley Lane, and other water system improvements of 1.5. Again, it's previously issued money, but as we're talking about the context of CIP, we thought it was important to bring that back to your attention. In terms of cash improvements in the wastewater fund, still at $1 million, no variance there from the budget book. And then on wastewater, there was a shifting of wastewater system improvements. Since we are kind of reutilizing this Brazos Basin funds, we could lower the amount of debt that we would need for wastewater improvements for FY21. And then lastly, WMARS, there is a couple of shifting projects here between the State Highway 6 wastewater improvements and the central plant. It's an increase from 2.5 million to 3.2 million due to adding 300,000 for easements, acquisition, and shifting $445,000 that was previously located in the State Highway 6 improvements. In total, the CIP that we're recommending for FY 2021 totals $112 million, 80.1 of that from the enterprise, with 32.6 from the governmental side. You can see the table at the bottom that shows the funding sources by enterprise and by governmental. Overall, the general capital projects, we feel this plan aligns with your council goals and it aligns with our fiscal constraints. We did see some movement in the solid waste projects. That's the biggest adjustment we've seen since the budget book adoption. Significant funding from CARES in the airport projects. And again, the utility projects are supported by the rates discussed previously with council in a 5-year span. At this time, I'm going to turn it over to our financial advising team, Masterson Advisors, Mr. Drew Masterson, to discuss the market conditions and the bond selling process moving forward.
May I ask a quick question before we get off the slideshow, please? The slide before this, where you're looking at the 5-year projection there, why would, and pardon me that I don't know this, but fiscal year 2022 and 2025 are much lower than the other 3 years? What's the reasoning behind that?
Yes, sir. So CIP has a tendency to have kind of big ebbs and flows. And what we'll do every year annually is try to smooth that out so that our debt capacity is even. At this point, that's just kind of the timing that we have set for the 5-year plan. But annually, to make sure that we can deliver projects within our fiscal constraints, we'll look to smooth out that 5-year plan.
So for anyone that might be watching this, it's not that we're slowing down on projects.
No, sir.
Right. Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, and before we get into the bond nuts and bolts with Masterson, yeah, no, all these projects every year, this gets a little more complex about how to keep up with the infrastructure, not only through growth but through maintenance and through deferred maintenance, because we're using a lot of funds here to catch up on maybe what past councils didn't have the resources to address. But I think this is a sound, initial plan here on how to use the bonding structure. And I appreciate staff's work on summarizing this. Paul and Isaiah, great job.
With that, I'll stop sharing and give it over to Drew.
Okay. Hello, everybody. Let me bring this screen up here. Be able to see that?
Yeah, I can see it. Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
Yes.
Again, my name is Drew Masterson with Masterson Advisors. We are your financial advisors on bond issues, which I know you guys have been through this before, so I'll just jump right into it. Just a little market context. This is a 10-year view, sort of our index that we follow in the bond world for general obligation bonds. And you can see where at near 10-year lows, we hit lows this summer. It's been a very volatile year, as you could imagine, with the quarantine and the impact on the economy. Generally speaking, obviously the quarantine has hammered the economy worldwide, which would tend to cause interest rates to go down. But when it first happened, there was a real panic in the markets and rates shot up in the muni world, not in the treasury world, but munis and corporate rates shot up. And then when liquidity was restored in our market a few weeks later, they came back down. And as I said, hit record lows this summer, and we're still near those record lows. Since the election, it's been very volatile again. Rates went down Thursday and Friday when there became to be an apparent winner, and then went up yesterday and a little bit today based on essentially the good news for the economy from the release of the 90% effectiveness of the vaccine in trials by Pfizer. So it's been a bumpy ride this year, as you can imagine. This slide looks at the certificates of obligation that that Paul and Isaias just went through, the projects. On the right side over here, you can see we're looking at issuing roughly 76 million. There's some premium on top of that that gets us to total projects of about 80 million. Debt service on the 76 million 8 with interest would total 99 million 8. Average annual debt service just under 4 million. The true interest cost would be 2.16%. And this is basically rates from about 2 weeks ago with 25 basis points cushion built in. So they'd be a little bit lower today, probably. You see on the summary of projects, the different CIP that was just gone over, the 30,053,000 for general obligation bonds, or the bond funded portion of the 32 million of CIP. As Paul mentioned, on the solid waste, we are recommending doing about $1.5 million of that on a taxable basis. That's the portion associated with the with the
landfill.
Landfill, thank you. That word was escaping me. With the idea that on the landfill, there could be potentially private operators, and that just leaves your flexibility open for private use, and is only costing about 50 or 60 basis points in the current market. So it's a sort of cheap way to leave options open on the landfill. Then the other projects here are all totaling with 30 million for general government and a total of 80 million altogether. You can see the amortizations on the left side of this page. Basically, everything's pretty much 20-year amortization with a few exceptions. We have the Old Hewitt Mars project at a 25-year amortization. You can see the tail end of that hanging out here. That's basically just for affordability purposes to squeeze that project in at the current tax rate. We needed to bump that out 5 years. And then we've got some equipment in the solid waste area over the first 10 years, just to match the useful life of the equipment. So everything else is pretty much level debt service for 20 years. We're also looking at doing some refunding together with the issuance of the certificates of obligation. We'd issue in 2 series, one for the COs and one for the GO refunding bonds. The bonds that we're looking at refunding are both from 2012. Most of the projects in those bonds were water projects. On the bigger issue, 89% of it was water. So that's where the benefit of the savings will go for the most part. The old bonds that we're refunding go out to 2035 and range in interest rates from 2.25% to 4%. So you can imagine refunding those with 2% and less on the shorter end is generating those savings. The savings roughly are about 160, 170,000 a year with a net present, well, totaling 2.5 million with a net present value of 2.2 million, which is 9% of the refunded bonds. So the all-in cost on the refunding portion of the issue is 1.67%.
Hey, Drew, remind me on the refunding portion. These are just ones that our call option has come up, right? We're still not allowed to do advanced refunding.
That's correct. We cannot do tax-exempt advance refundings.
Right.
Many issuers are considering taxable advance refundings. But we feel like with rates being so low, just a little patience and waiting till that call date, you don't pay that extra cost associated with the taxables. Plus, there's cuts out the negative arbitrage. So,
yeah.
In general, we've seen about 80 or 90 basis point break even from doing a taxable advance refunding versus waiting to do a tax exempt. So unless you think rates are going to go up more than 80 or 90 basis points over the next year or two, we're better off waiting. So that's what this refunding is looking at.
I agree with that. And if they do go up that much, I think we're in trouble for a number of reasons.
Could be. This slide looks at your.
This is Holmes. One more question on the bond refunding. I mean, this is such. I love this part of what we're doing. As far as looking at existing debt and how we can refinance to a lower rate and save. What did you say the present or the present value on here is?
2.2 million.
2.2 million. I mean that's real money that we're saving here. It's just tremendous. Now, overall, and going down the road that John was a little bit, there are lockouts, prepayment penalties on a lot of. I mean, we can't just take all of our over 2% debt and refinance it at 2%. There are some parameters around what we can and can't refinance. Can you just speak to that for a little bit?
Sure.
And real quick, I'll just a reminder, the 2017 Tax Act, our ability to do that a one-time advance refunding was taken away. So, I mean, there are parameters, but it was put in federal legislation and took a tool away from us to recognize savings like this that we did have, that they took that away from us a few years back.
That's right. You obviously have lots of other bonds that do have higher rates than 2%. And the problem is they're just not prepayable yet. They're not callable yet.
Yeah.
And when muni bonds are issued, they're typically issued with a 9 or 10 year par call. And so it's just waiting until we get to those dates. I guess the 2012s will be refunding in 2021. So we must have had a 9-year call on those when they were originally issued. We try to shorten those calls up whenever possible, but it can get expensive to shorten them very much. So,
right. You give up execution for a shorter lockout period. I get it. But yeah, 9 or 10 years is kind of the standard that.
Yeah. So if we're locking in, 167 and 211 on our bonds, how much do you want to pay extra to have call flexibility?
Exactly.
Not
exactly.
much, not much. So
Agreed. Thanks. You answered the question. Appreciate it.
This slide looks at your existing debt service by type of bonds. So the dark blue is on the bottom is your general obligation bonds. And I would stress here that we have a real drop off in your annual payments in 2028. And we'll come back to that when we look at your capacity page in a minute. But your debt service is roughly level, then drops down, and then is level again on your GO. Then we have your biggest user of bonds, which would be your water fund, your wastewater, second largest, and then a little bit of solid waste and TERS debt on top of that. You can see the different amortization periods as well, with the solid waste being the shortest because of the shorter useful life for the most part. This page I would this is just the principal portion of your debt service. So I don't think this is terribly instructive, but it is kind of interesting to see 24% of your outstanding debt is general obligation, 41% water, 32% wastewater, 1% solid waste, 2% TERS. This is a little more detailed than I typically like to put in a presentation, but I included it mainly for a couple of reasons. One is to emphasize that when we look at your general obligation bond capacity, as you all were discussing earlier, it's really a function of those cost savings you were talking about. And what are you going to allocate to the debt service tax rate? So this is the model that we use together with your staff to calculate, how many bonds are available for GEO infrastructure or general fund infrastructure. And as you saw a minute ago, 30,053,000 is the number for this year. That column is right here, amortized in. This model has the half-penny shift each year for 5 years. So a total of 2.5 cents more going over from the current tax rate going over to the INS tax rate over time. So that creates about 30 or 40 million of this capacity comes from that shift. And I would just point to this third column from the right over here where it says EDC contribution. That is the 3.4 million that the EDC is talking about sending over for the Mars Old Hewitt Road. And your staff came up with the idea of amortizing that contribution over the period of high debt service in the general fund that I showed you earlier on this slide. Basically, in these years, we take that subsidy from the EDC, and then when debt service drops down in 28, there won't be any subsidy anymore, but we can afford the bonds for old Mars Old Hewitt at that point without the subsidy. So does that make sense, what we're doing there? The next page looks at your bond ratings, and these are comments from earlier in the year, just before COVID, and all the changes that wrought on our world. And they're all generally very positive comments. Expanding economy anchored by Baylor and growing tourism industry. I'm looking at the Moody's column here, solid assessed valuation growth, consistent history of strong operating performance, which is your general fund operations and your enterprise funds, and their ability to support all the debt. The challenges that Moody's cites are low incomes on average compared to other cities. And then they note the high student population drags down your average incomes as well. So sort of a negative with an offsetting factor. And then they also note as a challenge, your debt profile is elevated but manageable. And excuse me, they then note, but when you look at the support from the utility funds on all the self-supporting debt, it's manageable. So they kind of say if you ever don't transfer all that money from the enterprise funds, it would be a bad thing for your bond rating. Moderate pension burden. Standard & Poor's, same comments about Baylor economy, anchoring the economy. The city is really behind a lot of the growth and diversification that's going on, which is great. Positive budgetary performance, cash funding a large portion of your capital expenditures, which you all have always done. Stable financial performance and policies and practices. They like your council approved policies, quite frankly, and to be honest, we use them as a model for other cities all the time. And then the strong reserve and liquidity position. S&P views your greatest challenge is your CIP, which I think we all feel.
Hey, Drew, have the ratings agencies, what are they indicating in terms of how they're treating the COVID-related kind of dip in, economic circumstances and revenue for cities? I like seeing what they've said about us, because I think those things, the policies and our management and the way we go about things, that's not changing. So I'm imagining we'll be fine. I'm just kind of curious more broadly as you interact with them, how temporary they're feeling the COVID stuff is, and kind of how they're treating that in terms of where they go ratings wise and projections wise.
Right. And I was supposed to cover that, Councilmember Kennard. I just forgot to. So thank you for your question. In general, they're taking a fairly long-term view of COVID. the impact on the economy. And they're looking at, solid credits such as yourselves and not making a lot of changes. Where they are making changes are the ones that were sort of on the brink to start with, and this kind of thing is just killing states like Illinois and cities like Chicago, where they were in trouble to start with and didn't have the reserves and the financial flexibility to weather a storm like this. So the first few months of the quarantine, we spent basically providing liquidity analysis to the rating agencies on virtually all of our clients. They just wanted to double check and make sure they had the latest numbers about who has the cash to survive, because as everybody knows, in any crisis, cash is king. And so it was a liquidity, experiment, or not experiment, a liquidity information download for about 2 months. Then they started focusing heavily on the types of enterprises in the muni world that are more affected by the quarantine, like convention centers, airports, toll roads, and healthcare, some private education as well. So a lot of effort over the summer went into sort of the specialty areas. We heard very little from them in the geo world, but almost all of our clients had reviews that had volatile revenue streams, and sales tax, bonds, that sort of thing, all got reviewed over the course of the summer. In general, with regards to Waco and these bonds, we really don't anticipate much impact in terms of the ratings on from COVID. They'll ask extra questions about, what are your extra costs? What have you done to manage those costs? How have you funded them? Have you gotten federal funding and that sort of thing? So there are some extra questions, but in general, they're very manageable in regards to this credit.
This is Holmes. Drew, I was really happy to see both rating agencies look at our reserves and balance sheet. I think it's so important to the city and to the council and to the city manager and staff that we have a healthy balance sheet that we're starting with, and having a rating agency kind of validate that with a stamp of approval, I think is important. And then the fact that we've gone up in our reserves, we are seeing a benefit here, in black and white here, that does mean something, that we are pushing our cash reserves up, which we made a big effort last year to do that. So I like how Moody's and S&P are both looking at the city of Waco. Appreciate your work with them.
Yeah, you bet.
Yeah, and I'll just follow. Oh, sorry. I'll just follow up real quick with Holmes to just say that, and it's being in good financial position makes our jobs a lot easier. And that's, again, just I can't say it enough. Just kudos to staff for recent performance, particularly during this tough time, but also over several years, to make sure we have the policies and procedures and the fiscal flexibility in place to be able to weather a storm like this and have the resources necessary to continue to invest in infrastructure and in the other needs that our community has. So it's, as always, just want to say to everybody that's been involved on this for a long time, because I'm not going to have many more chances to do that. Great job.
I should have also said your ratings are AA1, AA+, which are both one notch under AAA. So you're almost, the highest possible rating. And there's something to be said for not being AAA when you're AAA. I call it the golden handcuffs. You can't decide we need to do more infrastructure a little faster and things like that. If it hits your debt ratios, you're more likely to be downgraded. You have a lot more flexibility with that AA1, AA+, and in this low interest rate market, the interest rate differential is, who knows, 2-3 basis points, something like that. So very little very little distinction, but incredibly high ratings over the years. I remember I've got a hat in my closet which we all wore when Waco got their first AA rating. So y'all come a long way over the years. Timeline for the bond issue, looking at December meetings of y'all's and city council to kind of sign off on the plan and especially the notice of intent. With COs, we have to publish 45 days before sale. So your last council meeting where we could publish and have the 45 days is a December meeting in order to sell in early March. With that said, we understand that you're still fine-tuning your CIP. So we would need to approve a not to exceed CO number at the December meeting. You can always go lower when you actually issue. Then February, you would adopt the sale ordinance, which is what the 45 days has to be between is the adoption of the sale ordinance. Approve the preliminary official statement. We'll have the rating meetings in early February after the audit's completed, and then sell the first week of March. Funding would occur by the end of March. So that's what we had prepared for you, and happy to answer any additional questions.
I'll just say, this is Holmes. Drew, thanks for pulling this together. It's all the different moving parts of this are, they get sort of complex when you talk about, you don't want to over leverage the city. You do want to take advantage of these low rates. You don't want to, the pennies you were talking about on our ratio of operating and maintenance, part of our budget in the GO2 or in the general to debt service. It's a balance on all these items and trying to figure out a way to, again, take care of not only the growth of the city and the growing infrastructure needs, but also just the maintenance of that, of some of that capital. And then again, that deferred maintenance, how much, and again, it's the sources and uses. What are our sources here? We have some debt. We've got all these other fees and taxes, but we've got to be careful not to also overtax but keep up with all the needs of the city. It's a balancing act. I think we continue to refine our methods, which I really appreciate. Paul Diaz and Isaiah Spreza. I think the work that you've done here is really, really good. And Janice, you got a good team there in accounting also. So I appreciate all the work here. And as we move forward over the next few months on getting us all in place, I appreciate everybody's work. Thanks. Was there anything else on that item, Hector, John, or Bradley?
No,
Bradley,
sir, not on my end.
Bradley, you unmuted. Are you going to wrap something up?
I think that was all we wanted to cover on discussion number one. I think the only thing remaining is discussion two, which is a request for future agenda items. And if the council members have anything for that next meeting, which is planned for December 8th.
Hey, Bradley, I don't know if we can have this in time for December 8th, and if we can, it's totally fine. But I would like to revisit the street project. You know, we were talking about what's the timeline to get us at least to 70 and what it would take as far as money to get us there. And so maybe it's a good time to revisit that with the new council members. And if it's not at the December meeting, it's okay. But sometime in the near future, if we can just cover that, please.
We will mark that down as a future agenda item, and my anticipation would be we will be able to meet that December 8th timeline.
Any other future agenda items? Johnny, you got anything?
I'm saving all mine for next week. So
okay.
I got my list, but we'll save it for next week.
Yeah, Councilman Kennard is going off council next week. So if there are no further requests, the next regularly scheduled meeting date is December 8th, 2020. And there being no further business, we will adjourn the meeting at 2:29 p.m. Thanks, everybody.